on border wars and the two freedoms. Regardless of our political leanings, nearly all would agree that America has been lacking a needed, coherent, and updated immigration policy. For that's been the case for the last several presidential administrations. And each administration has kicked the problem down the road, being unable or unwilling to effect an agreeable compromise with the party not in power. Like so many of America's pressing problems, there's been a lack of a unified political will. Yet the current political skirmish about protecting America's southern border has also become the fodder for a border war, not with Mexico, but between America's two contesting political parties. The Republicans are right, that is, to draw attention now to this long unsolved problem, which, if anything, has only gotten worse. And facing an upcoming election where their own candidate will apparently be a multiply indicted former president, they now blame our leaky borders on Biden, whom they're also trying to impeach, without first having produced any evidence for grave crimes and misdemeanors, while their own candidate's entire adult life has been replete with them. And so what seems more true here is that it would be both morally and politically irresponsible to abandon Ukraine at a pivotal point in defending itself against the Russian aggressor, or make U.S. support now dependent upon first fixing a border problem America hasn't been able to resolve for decades. Different kinds of border wars are also currently being fought between Israel and Hamas, and aside from Russia and Ukraine, there's another long-contested border conflict looming between China and Taiwan. Yet, in an increasingly global world, each of these conflicts also wind up involving other nations, and they're contesting political ideologies, mainly Democrats versus autocracies. In Gaza, Hamas continues to hold hostages taken in a bloodthirsty attack upon Israeli citizens that also murdered approximately 1,300 Israelis, while the Israeli army continues to bomb Gaza to smithereens. As of this reporting, approximately 18,000 Palestinian civilians have died in this war, including an unknown number of Hamas fighters. The Hamas fighters are allegedly fighting for the freedom of their people, yet they are also psychopathic, wish to kill all Jews, have also bankrupted the economy, failed to allow elections, and hide behind the civilian population being bombed now in a war that they started. It's also possible that Hamas game-planned the Israeli overreaction as a means of bringing neighboring countries to turn against Israel and halt the momentum of an Israeli agreement with the Saudis and other Gulf states. This has left the presidential administration of Joseph Biden navigating a tricky path between its commitment to support Israel on the one hand yet trying to moderate the excesses of Israel's autocratic-leaning leader, a leader facing charges of corruption, while attempting to degrade the oversight powers of the Israeli judiciary, a leader who has consistently shown no interest in supporting a two-party solution between Israel and the Palestinians. For years, Netanyahu has actually supported Hamas, including covertly with suitcases of cash, as a way of disempowering the Palestinian Authority. In truth, in its regard of Palestinians, Netanyahu's policies have resembled the former apartheid policies of South Africa, and Gaza and the West Bank are not that different from the reservations in which America dispatched its native peoples after decades of genocidal Indian wars. Well, democracy, I guess, is a tough slog for all who attempt it, while Israel has only been in existence since 1948, and I wish it well as it's working out the kinks, while the American experiment has been trying democracy out since 1776, and we still aren't that great at it either. In the short run, autocracies are easier, for they require neither compromises, nor an informed citizenry, nor checks and balances upon their leaders, all of which can make them more venal. Learning how to respect, care for, and love other people, especially those very different from us, is also difficult. And similarly, why Gurdjieff said that if you want to learn how to love other people better, start with animals and plants. They're easier. And like Hamas, America's Republican Party is currently holding aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan hostage until and unless the Biden administration agrees to install a more Trump-like approach to immigration in its defense of the southern border. Trump, who's also an autocrat, is already speaking of the mass internment camps and mass deportations he'd install if elected president. Here again, this places Biden between a rock and a hard place, for he caves into the Republicans on immigration in order to fund our other allies. He'd also face a loss of support from Hispanics in the upcoming election, which, surprisingly, promises to be a close one. And should a more draconian approach to undocumented workers prevail, this would also be catastrophic to the American economy and gravely spike the inflation that has lately diminished. In truth, America is in need of its undocumented workforce to support economic growth. Without them, there'd be a perilous loss of agricultural and construction labor, and many of the restaurants that managed to survive the pandemic would be hard-pressed to survive. Trump is saying that he'd end the war in Ukraine on the first day of his presidency should he win in 2024. What that means is he'd cut off all aid to Ukraine, ensuring a Russian victory. And in fact, Putin's war effort in Ukraine has become a war of delay, just as delay has been the legal strategy in the trials Trump is facing, and both for the same reason, that is, to manage a status quo until November of 2024 in the hope of a Trump electoral victory. As I've said elsewhere, like birds of the same feather, autocrats and psychopaths resemble each other and tend to flock together. And yet, if continuing aid to Ukraine isn't promptly forthcoming, the true recipient aided by this will be Putin, though China and its autocratic leader will also be aided in their hunger for Taiwan, and the world's other autocracies would be emboldened as well. This would leave our wider global world in a yet more vulnerable and perilous condition than it is already. And Russia has already shifted its economic priorities. 40% of its revenues have now been mobilized to its war effort, a full-on war economy. The Russians have managed to hold course, if just barely, due in part to an approximate 6-month delay on the part of Ukraine's foreign allies in providing Ukraine with the more potent weaponry the Ukrainians have needed throughout each phase of the war. This, more recently, has enabled Russia to strengthen its defenses in the territories it's invaded, thus slowing the pace of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. This doesn't mean that the war in Ukraine has stagnated into an unending, unwinnable stalemate. The war is actually greatly in flux, yet from the beginning of the war, Russia's economy and the number of its citizens was by many times greater than Ukraine's, and with the Russian military now receiving the influx of a wartime economy and able for the first time to manufacture its own drones, in addition to weaponry provided by Iran and North Korea, Ukraine thus must continue to receive the support of America and her Western allies. Otherwise, the tides of this war will have shifted significantly in favor of Russia. And the failure to continue to adequately support Ukraine would also, importantly, degrade the Pax Americana that has prevailed, at least in Europe, since the end of the Second World War. Aside from being dangerously short-sighted, this would constitute an abrogation of responsible leadership currently considered now by an isolationist part of America's political body. Yet in a global world, it would further cost the U.S. and the rest of the free world going forward. For what isn't being broadcast from the right wing of America's political spectrum is that the funds America has provided to Ukraine have actually been extremely cost-effective. For approximately 4% of the U.S. defense budget, and with no loss of American lives, the Ukrainian army has paid with its own blood in defending the future of the free world. Unlike America's bitterly divided nation, Ukraine has become a unified nation of freedom fighters. That's what they're fighting for, freedom. Theirs is also a just and noble fight, and they've been fighting courageously. While freedom, rather than tyranny, is, or has been, a foundational value of the American experiment since its inception as a nation, when America too was fighting for its freedom. And so, if you want to see what true patriotism and political courage looks like today, look no farther than the average Ukrainian citizen. Its authentic versions are far harder to find in the average American politician. Though today, without siding with many of her views, I'd nominate Liz Cheney. And earlier, I might have said the same for John McCain, both of whom castigated by Trump, incidentally. In fact, any Republican political figure who wouldn't kiss Trump's ring and become an election denier has been thrown under the bus. The result has been that the grand old party of Abraham Lincoln has devolved into a slavish gang of unrepentant cowards. The stakes here should be obvious. Unfortunately, they are not. And that's not just because of the rhetoric being broadcast or failing to be broadcast by parts of the Republican Party. God love them, because sometimes I can't. Instead, it's because freedom can and needs to be understood in two very different ways. One is extroverted and often political. It's the kind of freedom I've been evoking thus far. The other freedom is more spiritual and has to do with a kind of inner jihad, the struggle against the blindnesses of one's own ego and its own would-be enhancements. And in that, Trump is hardly alone, even if he's become the poster boy for an ego that's out of control and unwilling to accept any constraints, like a spoiled child who's always gotten his way without ever being held accountable. The problem here is that if we have little concern or understanding of the second kind of freedom, we'll be bewildered about accomplishing the first. You might want to hear that again. If you have little understanding of inner freedom, the freedom from your own self-serving ego, you'll remain bewildered or unconcerned about accomplishing the more political freedom or defending it. For how can you nurture or bestow what you fail to understand and can't yet embody? Both forms of freedom are hard to achieve and both easily lost. Yet both freedoms are worth striving for, even if the struggles for both are only partially obtained and never permanently achieved. As for American democracy, it's not really a battle for a perfect union. That's a mission impossible. If you're looking for freedom, you've incarnated on the wrong planet. The term that is actually found in our founding document is actually a more perfect union, not a perfect union, a more perfect union. That is, something more relative and not impossibly absolute. And that's always going to be a little messy and contentious at times, a work in progress, just like ourselves. This consideration of the two freedoms is no small thing, for we're at a crucial inflection point where we must access a vision that is both spiritually and politically discerning. The early polling isn't encouraging. Yet the future of our world hinges upon that vision and the number of our citizens capable of embodying it. For the stakes in our elections now couldn't be higher. Will we continue to ratify the vision of our founding fathers, or will we be complicit in sleepwalking towards tyranny?